How many Easters the Easter Bilby played into your celebration?
Like it was there. I mean, but I feel like it was mostly, it wasn't like my family were doing Easter Bilby things. You know what I mean? It was like at
I love how we're
school.
talking about this Easter Bilby nonsense. Meanwhile, the chat is going, Alpha Stream's here! We get Teos this week! Oh my god! Everything's amazing! Oh, the Easter Bilby is not in fact a significant part of Australian Easter celebrations.
That's all the time I have. Thanks. This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
Oh boy!
Possibly the virtual tabletop will be available on consoles.
Where I've always wanted to play D&D on my couch in front of my TV.
Don't talk to James about the magic missile.
What was the mood in the room?
From the Wizards' perspective, they thought this is going great. From the attendee side, it was like, but when are we going to talk about my burning issue?
We can have D&D esports.
No, don't do that.
I'm going to put on my hater hat. I don't like the name Tales of the Valiant all that much.
I get it. I know how this works, and we move on to read the ORC, and it turns out we don't, and we're unhappy about that.
It is kind of wild to me that a legal license is now a driver of like consumer engagement.
5th edition, 2nd edition.
All that and more.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG and Australian culture podcast in all of the spheres. That's right, we're spreading out even further beyond movies and tabletop RPGs. There's going to be something that comes up during this episode, I'm sure. My name is Ben Byrne, and I'm joined, as always, by James Hake, Dael Kingsmill, and this week, filling in for Sean Merwin, the other half of Mastering Dungeons, we have pulled in Teos Abadia. Teos, welcome to the Eldritch Lorecast.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. I can't Sean like I wish I could, but I will try.
Okay, all right. We'll rate you how many Sean's out of 5 you do by the end of the episode. Question for you, Teos. I need to know, because I assume you get flump questions constantly.
Sure.
So I have to ask, what is your favorite D&D monster, or even like fantasy monster if we want to go beyond the scope of D&D, that isn't a flump?
The Behir.
Nice.
Also
I love
known from this. I think this is where it started. But yeah, I really like the Behir and also the Remoraz. Those are probably my 2 favorite monsters that aren't a flump. I love the Behir's ability to coil you up. Anything that can swallow you, I'm a big fan of. So the Remoraz does that. I'm a huge fan of anything that when you hit it, it does damage to you. So then I don't need to hit you. You can hit yourself. So Remoraz and Behir, that's my pick.
See, I feel Teos brought like show and tell. I don't have anything to hold up. I am torn at the moment. My go-to D&D answer is probably a Displacer Beast or a Gnoll. I'm a big fan of Gnolls.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
But at the moment, I've been working on some myth stuff, and Chimera just in my brain. They're very cool.
An owlbear, technically a type of chimera.
I mean,
really,
yeah.
in little C sense.
Yeah, in the little C biological sense that it is a combination of animals, yes. Give it a fire breath weapon. Oh,
there you go. There's
that's
a scary
druid.
owlbear. I see you looking over at your props shelf, James Hake. What is your favorite D&D monster?
I know. I'm looking over there. I've got about 1 million dragon miniatures up there because I love dragons so much. Really, my favorite D&D monster is a Mind Flayer. I mean, it's second to none. While y'all were talking, was making me think, what would an illithid-infected dragon be like? I think Fizban's has some kind of mind-flaying dragon in it, but I have to admit, I have not given that book more than a cursory glance.
It's got great art.
I really need to run a campaign that's all Mind Flayers all the time, because despite my loving them, despite the first adventure I wrote centering them, never really had a full-on eldritch horror, corruption, plus B-movie silliness sort of Mind Flayer campaign. And oh, I would love that so much. Earlier this year, I finished Bloodborne for the very first time, which has a really neat little hat trick where it pretends that you're going into this sort of bloody gothic setting, and then it kind of rug pulls you into cosmic horror. And having that sort of thing happen with traditional fantasy, I think would be a very cool little thing. Wizards might be doing it in the Phandelver campaign coming up. So, I don't know, maybe now's the time.
Well, speaking of Wizards of the Coast, Oh boy. All right. Roll up our sleeves. Here we go. I feel like 2 weeks ago when we had the Lorecast, like 12 hours before the D&D Direct, we were getting news from a dripping tap, and now it's just fire hose in the face, just constant information coming out of the Creator Summit, D&D Direct. There's some other bits of news here that are not Wizards related, which is kind of nice, I'm not going to lie. But let us jump into the Creator Summit. Teos, you were there physically in the room. There's a lot to talk about here, so I'm going to throw it to you to just what was your main or small couple of takeaways that you think are some of the most important stuff that stood out to you from the Creator Summit?
Yeah, going in, I was a little concerned that the variety of people that had been defined as creators might be a little too wide a term, you know? And so I was a little worried that people wouldn't be able to properly kind of give feedback the way I'd been to a 2011 event before when 5e was being sort of initially created. And I was really glad to be pleasantly surprised that the 30 folks that were there in person and also all the like 100 people that were online really gave, I think, a really nice participation to Wizards and gave Wizards tons of feedback on a lot of different issues, both the things they expected to talk about and the things they didn't so much expect to talk about. And that was a really big takeaway. It was like, our creator community, they know when to stand up and say important things and take on important issues.
I really appreciate reading your blog, the Alpha Stream blog, because it the last couple of weeks in particular, or a couple of months, there's been a lot of emotional reactions to things that have been coming out of Wizards. And going to the Alpha Stream blog tends to have a very level-headed take on what's going on and kind of gets rid of a lot of the clickbaity style reporting that can be like, click on this, look at this, Wizards mess up again, or whatever people choose to throw, whatever the Lorecast chooses to use as its thumbnail that week. I'm going to be honest. But what was the mood in the room when you were there? There was one point we've heard where Wizards kind of decided, look, we can continue showing you what we've planned, but obviously you have different expectations and we want to address the concerns that you have.
It wasn't just one mood, and I think it speaks to the diversity of creators that were there, right? There were folks who, like, I met a person who was there who said, I'm here just to network, and then there were people who are, I'm here to fight for issue X, right? Like, sure. Issue X or die. I have got to get this across. This is the thing that I live and die for, and then everything in between, right? And so there were a lot of different people in the room, and how they see it could shape it, right? So my perspective, I'm a person who does a lot of things for work that are in kind of professional settings that are like this event. So I see these kinds of events often, and generally they're very tame, and there's only so much you can do. And even when I'm part of these kinds of events, like, I'm not the best at pivoting. When someone says, yeah, I don't want that thing that you prepared, give me this other thing, I'm like, but I prepared, it's here, and I have trouble changing. And Wizards actually pivoted pretty well, given, compared to a lot of these events that I see. And so, what was the mood? The mood was that nobody knew what the agenda was from our side, from the attendee side, neither online or in person. And so at first it was fine. And I think Wizards was thinking, hey, we've got a bunch of things that we're going to walk these folks through. And at every step, we're going to say, give us your feedback, tell us what you think, help us shape the future. And so from the Wizards' perspective, they thought, this is going great. And from the attendee side, it was like, but when are we going to talk about my burning issue, right? Or issues. And so the collective mood and tone started to just kind of get more and more heated. And I described sort of like, two trains crashing. And they were kind of unaware of each other, right? Like, and so who you ask in the room might have a slightly different take, but in general, it was a building sense of frustration for many of, you're acting like there are no other issues other than these kinds of release-oriented issues, which of course is what companies do when they're doing these kinds of events. And what's cool is that, Wizards did kind of go like, first of all, they answered every question. So it would be the VTT session and someone's asking about how are diverse people being hired? And the head of diversity, says, I'll I'll hand that, and the director of diversity comes down and takes the mic and answers the question and then gives it back. And then the next question is also similar, and she comes back up and grabs the mic and says, I'll answer that. And, but at some point it was like, hey, folks, we need to go to the next session. And everybody's like, no, or not everybody, but a majority said, no, we came to discuss this. And there were a few kind of, and it sounds heated, but it was, I've seen really bad heated, right? This wasn't terrible heating. It wasn't disrespectful. It was really proper. It was sort of like, with all due respect, I'm here to talk about these important issues. And they said, okay, let's take a vote. Do you want to hear Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford, or do you want to, talk another half hour for this? And the majority raised their hands and said yes. And so it continued along that line, which is pretty cool, because once Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins started talking, it was hilarious. It was the mood change. You're talking about mood and tone. Like all of a sudden, everybody's like, tell us about the game, Chris and Jeremy. Like they weave a spell, right? Like a bard. They're just like, and now we should tell you about the game. Oh.
Those two do have, I think, so, especially listening to them at the end of the D&D Direct as well, they have like very pleasing, calming baritones that and just seem so in control whenever they're talking about D&D. That said, I can imagine they're like, we can bring out Jeremy and if you wanted, and Crawford if you wanted to, and they're just in the wings going, no, don't do
that. Hats off to them for even taking the mic after that. Like I'd be afraid to enter that room, right? And they were there the whole time and very willing to speak to everybody when it was their time to speak. But I think that, it was like a pressure cooker, right? That the pressure had to the top had to come off and steam had to be vented so that everybody could go back to normal. And so once everybody got to ask questions, felt heard, and Wizards, throughout the entire event, there were people with notepads just jotting down things. And I know it was real because like I would go to lunch and, Jacob from D&D Beyond would come up and sit at the lunch table and say like, that thing you were talking about, about an on-ramp for creators, do you think that da-da-da-da-da? And then Nathan Stewart would say something, and then someone else, and like all these staff members were taking you seriously and following up on things that you raised. So there was clearly, that kind of approach to it. And yet still, but they were focused on sort of their questions. And so once there was the opportunity for the community to kind of give that sort of feedback on wider issues, then it was, the tenor changed and everybody enjoyed the Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford show as they discussed all the 2024 changes.
It's so fascinating to me when you talk about those two trains, those non-aligned expectations, because this clearly was, which is fine, corporations are going to hold press events and they're going to want to promote what they're working on. And so Wizards seem to be expecting to be like, excitement, VTT, new tabletop. But it's awesome that when that wasn't the expectation that their audience, that the creators came to it with, they were like, oh, well, actually, that's really interesting. Tell us more about what you're talking about. Dael and James, again, there's so much that came out of here. There's so many different conversations that we could almost have an entire episode on. What are some of the things that stood out to you that were coming out of Creator Summit?
Oh, goodness. I feel like my opinion hardly matters in this discussion, and I don't mind that. I'm very, very eager to just hear about what was all going on over there. There's been a lot of discussion about a lot of issues ranging from, like you mentioned, Teos, how are diverse people of diverse backgrounds getting into Wizards, into the gaming industry. And, having been at Big Bad Con this last October, which has a huge focus on that, Wizards was a sponsor of that event. And so I'm glad to hear that people are asking them that question, because it means they have to think about it. And hopefully they already have. And, on the other side of the spectrum, what is the role of half races, in big quote marks, in the upcoming rules refresh for 5th edition? And I'm just kind of eager to see it play out, because I've got some opinions, mostly from the perspective of a game designer, but I'm much more interested in what everyone else has to say.
It makes a ton of sense, right? That Wizards is imagining this as, hey, well, let's get more direct feedback on our upcoming products so that we can, shape them to match the community's expectations. I fully expected that to be what the event was, but it also makes heaps and heaps of sense that lots of the people who were invited to attend the event were thinking, well, this is our only chance to speak so directly. Like, you hear these stories about the staff for Wizards of the Coast stopping and chatting in between the sessions. And that's such valuable connection directly between the company and the community that, of course, people are going to try to seize that opportunity to talk about the things that matter to them, that maybe aren't as, top of the list or on the radar of Wizards of the Coast. So I completely understand. And like James, I feel like I'm not, the voice of those things. Other people can speak to it better. So I'm going to talk about the stuff that Wizards of the Coast wanted to talk about that I found interesting, which makes me feel I'm the real shill of all of this. It's me all along. But no, yeah, I was reading through the notes that we got last week after our recording, and there were some things that stood out to me, particularly with regards to the virtual tabletop and sort of D&D Beyond sort of improvements going forward. One of them was talking about the virtual tabletop. There was a statement here that sort of says, how does Wizards of the Coast feel that their virtual tabletop can be competitive while only offering a platform for playing this one game? And the answer is, our position is unique as we own the rules we're making the game for. So utility changes that match the rules, the competitive advantage that we have, hiding elements, etc. And to me, that's a really funny answer. I would love to hear the complete answer, because the thing they listed is not unique to their virtual tabletop. I really need just something a little bit deeper. The idea that D&D Beyond and possibly the virtual tabletop will be available on consoles. They're using the Unreal Engine, so porting to consoles is a really interesting idea for
I've
D&D.
always wanted to play D&D on my couch in front of my TV.
No, but think about it, Ben, because this isn't for groups who are playing in person at the table.
Sure.
Like, once you're talking about consoles, that's for the groups who are playing at home but digitally with each other. And that actually, I think, is super interesting. That's a super valuable thing. And we're talking about the specs of this virtual tabletop. Will people have computers that are able to run it? If you've got your dinky work laptop, maybe not. But if you've got your Xbox that you already had, suddenly that, I think, opens up availability a little bit more than we were talking about before.
I agree, but like an Xbox, and who knows, like, will this run on like an Xbox One? Will you need a One X? Will it work on a PS4? Do you need a PS5? Those things are not only still very expensive, but hard to get sometimes. Like the COVID kind of ramifications are still kind of hitting the console market in a really weird way. So when they talk about accessibility, and that was a question that came up to my understanding during the Creator Summit, was what are the specs of this virtual tabletop going to be? Do I need an Alienware computer to be able to run them? And somebody correct me if I'm remembering this incorrectly, but the answer that came from Wizards was, would you want to know that? Would you want to know what the specs? Is that important to you to know what the specs of this software is? And it's like, yeah. Yes, we need, like you said, accessibility. How accessible is this accessibility?
It is also one of the places where, as much as we can say this won't be a video game, that is where you are treading in video game territory. Every video game that you go to buy on Steam has a list of the specs that will be required for running that game. You know what I mean? And that's just the fact of software.
I think it's really fascinating that the word accessibility is coming up in this discussion. And it may have even caught Wizards off guard, because accessibility means many different things.
Well, they said it themselves.
Yeah.
Like, that was one of the three things that they listed as like important to them in building this VTT.
Yes, but what kind of accessibility did they mean by that, right? One of the people who was at the summit, Jen Kretschmer, is a huge accessibility advocate, and she made some very interesting points at the summit from my understanding. But that's about accessibility from the standpoint of disability. Whereas we're talking about accessibility from the context of marketability and purchasability.
Yeah, well, not even just, so it's, equipment access, it's economical access, and that's not even to touch on, language accessibility. There's so many different layers to it. I'm frequently on my soapbox about economic accessibility when it comes to D&D. This is part of why I'm always railing against the 3 core book system, because 3 core books at 60 AUD a pop is a lot.
Well, I got good news for you, but we'll come back to that. Go on.
I'll say we had those kinds of discussions there, which was great, right? And that's why it was great to have people like Jen in the room who could speak up to it. And there were a number of people who spoke up to those kinds of questions of like, hey, we're all playing here on Alienware. That's awesome. But like, none of us can afford that, let alone in other countries. How's this going to work? And what's the localization? And, what's the diversity of art? And something that, I've thought about as I do more and more art orders is it's really easy to think about the characters, but not even the places, right? Like, do the places look like they are other, they're not just Western European places, right? And villages and so on. Castles, all of that. And so just there's so much that you can do, right? And I think that's the kind of thing that Wizards got a lot of feedback on, is all the different things to look at. And then you try to balance that out with everything else they're doing.
Totally. I also, from some of the notes, I do wonder how much of Wizards of the Coast's approach to this was looking at content creators like streamers. How can we make this the best possible thing for those people? Because we want to get more entertainment products out of our ongoing efforts, because that creates, further advertising, furthers the community, furthers the culture of D&D. But if you're so focused on how can we make this virtual tabletop a great tool for streamers, which is great. I think that's a really cool thing to talk about. What can we add to make this really great for you and your stream or whatever you're going to make? But it does get to a weird point where it's like, okay, but their experience and what they're looking to create from D&D is different to the average consumer. Yeah, and then you get to this place of accessibility again, just new players, just people who haven't played D&D before and are completely new to the process. There was a statement, I could be reading the notes that I've got wrong, but this idea of D&D Beyond having a character creation system that works almost like a quiz. Like, this is the situation. What do you do? Do you sneak around? Do you attack the guards? And it builds the character for you based on these answers, right? And that is something that is extremely accessible, but where does that fall on the scale between, brand new players versus veteran players?
Yeah, I look forward to deciding what I do when my friend steals a sweet roll, and then I have to decide: do I return the sweet roll? Do I eat the sweet roll? Do I break the sweet roll?
Stole your sweet roll.
Yeah. I'm curious because it feels to me with the VTT, they have taken a swing for the fences with this thing. They've really wanted to, and this is all conjecture for the record, what I'm about to say. But it looks, except for, if I'm remembering the name of it correct, Tailspire, it looks very distinct from Roll20. It looks very distinct from virtually any other virtual tabletop. It feels like what they've wanted to differentiate their virtual tabletop is this thing looks awesome. It is immersive, I think was one of their other kind of key phrases that they used. And so kind of beefing it up so much, they maybe have slightly forgotten about potentially the accessibility issues around cost and, who has what hardware, etc. Leading to a question, and I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with Tailspire, but I'm curious how that works. Does that require gaming PC? Does anyone in the chat know? Because that might be kind of a mild guide on how this might go. No, cool. Anyway,
I'm gonna pull up my Steam and look at the specs. Give me a minute.
Yeah, but it was neat. Like I could take my mouse and I could fly through the village, and I could fly through a window and into the tavern, and then look up from behind my character at the Ankeg we were fighting, and then that was pretty cool to do. So the visual is awesome, and their approach is very freeform, right? So like I could. In some ways, it felt a lot like Owlbear Rodeo to me, but on steroids, right? So it was this amazing looking interface. And it did have things like if I went to move my token, it would say, 30 feet is here. But I could actually put my mini wherever I wanted to. I could put them in the fireplace. I could put them on the wall. It didn't have those kinds of video game controls that go, no, it is not your turn, right? It was like I could attack when it wasn't my turn.
How intuitive were the controls? Sorry.
Not bad, but apparently they've already changed the interface. So I'm not too worried about what we saw. I think that they know they'll figure that part out, I think, decently well. It was the kind of thing that you would learn, right? You'd get used to it. It wasn't super intuitive, but you'll pick up on it. But apparently that's already even changed since this build. So, yeah.
Calling this thing Owlbear Rodeo on steroids has done more to sell it for me than every other bit of marketing in the past year. Because I love Owlbear Rodeo. I love how, accessible it is. It's so lightweight and it's so easy to, make it work and just kind of, trust your players and yourself to do what you want to do and not feel like you're fussing around with Roll20's kind of fiddly fog of war or getting bogged down in the weeds of all these flips and tricks. If it's a really powerful, pretty looking Owlbear Rodeo, I would be very happy.
And I like that aspect of it too, especially for accessibility. The other side of it is, though, that what they're currently doing is you copy sort of D&D Beyond elements into the virtual tabletop. And so that means that sort of a standard thing that would be in D&D Beyond is also here, but separate from it, right? It's not linked. So we asked could I modify this Ankheg to make my own custom one and then bring that over? No, you'd have to do that in the virtual tabletop because it's not really linked. It's sort of back end copied, right? Like server side copied rather than you are copying it. And so, it's not like you can just use all of your D&D Beyond in there. And that's how D&D Beyond has sort of approached things, right? Like the mobile site is a copy that's periodically brought in from the website, right? And that kind of thing. It's that sort of approach to it. And that creates limits because one of the nice things about Roll20 is when you have the full rules, you have that integration there solidly and you can modify it there. And so when you want to sink your teeth into things, you can do it in Roll20 right there. Owlbear Rodeo, well, there are no teeth to sink into. This is all very light and easy, and that's its appeal, right? And D&D Beyond is sort of in between and the virtual tabletop of it, and they'll have to think about how they want to, how that works for people over time, whether it feels good enough to do that, and how do you modify a monster? How do you modify a room? Because they said their vision was that if the player says, is there a window in this room that you can easily plunk one in, right? Sort of Lego style.
That was going to be my question.
That would be wild, though, if you were playing on a virtual tabletop and you could see the room and you asked, is there a window in this room? Did they show the construction tools or the DM tools at all, or was this all very player focused?
They did a little bit in that, they at one point brought in a 2D map. So we had this gorgeous 3D map that's sort of like an island sitting there in the middle of a fog. And then they just put a flat map on it. And so, the world was 3D, right? You could look at it, but it was a plane and it was just flat and you could put your miniatures on top of it, of course. And so they're just showing how you could do that in the fact that two right next to each other, or it could have been a handout or anything like that. And that was kind of fun to see. And then they did that just during the game. But that right now, I think all the pieces they have are sort of constructs, right? It is the tavern. Eventually they want to have that the tavern can be deconstructed and rebuilt and that you could do this on the fly. That's their goal, but that doesn't exist yet.
That seems like a great way to, microtransaction monetize the platform. They're going to do it somehow. Everyone does it. There's nothing that doesn't do it anymore. And asset packs and prefab locations. I mean, I follow almost a half dozen different independent Patreon creators who create gorgeous, truly gorgeous work of art battle maps. And if Wizards were to do something like that, really high quality 3D digital stuff for their VTT, it sounds like a great plan.
Yeah.
Did they go into any information about how customizable because speaking of monetization and microtransactions as well, the player character minis, we've seen it's the same minis from the announcement last year seem to be used in the little dwarf and the orc looking dude and the raven looking sorcerer or warlock. Mm-hmm. And then the Ankheg itself, I think as a DM, I it's not just the rules of a monster I want to change, it's the appearance of a monster, it's its pose. I choose my miniatures based on how threatening this thing looks to the party to put the players in the mood. Did they discuss any customization around, like, you can change the pose of your mini, sort of Hero Forge style, or you can change the colors of the Ankeg so it looks more, I don't know, whatever. It's all blood red.
They mentioned some aspects of that being on their goal list, but I think further down the road, and it's not clear. Anything economics, they were clearly conscious of it, right? So the lead for the game, he was talking about, for the design, he was talking about, you must be careful that you don't create something that is free when you didn't intend it to be free, or that's super expensive when you meant for it to be affordable. And the pricing model must be right, but we don't know what it is yet, and we don't know what's going to be add-ons versus not. And I looking at things like casting a magic missile or fireball, it was cool, but that
Don't
kind of
talk
stuff,
to James about the magic missile.
Yeah, I heard that. I enjoyed that a little bit, and I agree with you. I mean, and I'm the kind of person who gets very used to those things. Like it's cool the first time I see it, and then I'm done, and I really would just like 2 seconds of my life back instead of some animation. So everything I've ever seen at Gen Con or something that shows me like they're playing cards but with a 3D hologram, no thank you. I that is not me. And in fact, what I really want is to stare people in the face, right?
Yes.
So any virtual tabletop to me is my fallback, that I, for some reason, could not stare people in the face, which is what I really want to do. And every time I play, like when I was at Winter Fantasy last time, and I was just looking at human beings in their eyes as they were excited and telling me what their character did, I'm like, that's the game. That's why I come to this. I don't come for tokens and stuff. And not that I don't want them to be good, because sometimes I do. I play Roll20, I try Owlberry, I do all these things. But for me, this is all secondary to the rest of the game.
When it comes to animations, this is where learning from competitive video games, someone in chat mentioned Magic Arena. This is a great example. Because, animations can slow down gameplay, especially in games where the animation isn't a core part of the gameplay. Right? Like if you change the animation speed in a fighting game, it's all over for you. That game doesn't work anymore. But if you're playing like a strategy game, like a Final Fantasy Tactics or a Fire Emblem or something like that, if you skip the animation, or if you can alter the speed of the animation, it's purely aesthetic and it's purely player preference. If there's a slider in there,
It's also great for speedrunners.
Yeah. I mean, if there's an options menu, right? They're going towards video game stuff, so go all the way. Put a little options menu in there, say animation speed, take it from 0.25 all the way up to all the way up to 5x. How fast do you want that magic missile to go? Do you want it just to be like that? Let it be just that. It seems perfectly in fitting with the do it your own way mood that we've seen of the VTT so far.
That I would be curious to know, and I'm not sure whether this was demonstrated or not, but like when you cast Magic Missile, can you just press a button that's like cast Magic Missile, the dice get rolled, the animation all fire, and it just kind of automates and fires off.
Sort of hotkey style.
Yeah, well, and what's the customization behind that? Can you have it without the animation? Can you have it without showing the numbers? You just get without showing the dice roll, you just get the final number,
I think that would be a cool thing to do. I mean, Fantasy Grounds definitely lets you sort of hotkey abilities and, press 1 to cast Magic Missile. It'd be really cool to see. I actually, in this moment, I don't know if I'll stand by this in a week's time, but in this moment right now, I'm excited unironically about the idea of getting a whole new faction of D&D culture that is speedrunners who take the official adventures and play it on the virtual tabletop, and they just try to get the campaign done as quickly as possible. That would be so funny.
I can tell you this has already been a thing in organized play.
What?
It used to be that in the 3rd edition Living Greyhawk campaign, you had to travel to places to play adventures. So your time was very limited. You'd go for a weekend and you're like, I need to get all the old adventures I can while I'm here in, Connecticut or whatever, and before I go back home. So you're like I'd visit Bissell in Connecticut because I'd left, my area of Jeff in the DC area. And you would say, hey, can you run this thing for me as a Midnight Madness adventure? And one time in Connecticut, this guy Nick Gomez ran an adventure for me. And I think he did it a 4-hour adventure in like 30 minutes. He speed talked, then he'd ask like 2 questions. And he'd be like, okay, that's encounter's done. And then he'd speed talk again. And suddenly we had rewards and treasure. Not legal. I don't agree with this, but boy, it was fun.
Oh, bring it back digitally. We can have D&D esports.
Wait, didn't we have a whole controversy about this like 3 years ago? Don't go back there. Don't go back
Suddenly
there.
I'm in. I'm sold.
How quickly can you finish Tomb of Annihilation?
Yes. You've got two different rooms.
I remember at Origins back in 2017 when Tomb of Annihilation was big. The D&D Open there at Origins had a huge race element to it, like speedrunning race, not like races we've been talking about for D&D. Different controversy. Where there was this dungeon and everyone was like, there were 50 tables and they were all in it at the same time. And maybe it was the first party, or maybe the first 4 parties or something, that got to the center of the maze, got this special treasure, and then the enormous undead Tyrannosaur kind of erupted from the middle of the dungeon vault, and suddenly it turned into, oh crap, we gotta get out of the dungeon now. And so the experience was very different for everyone depending on the outcome of the race. That was so cool. There's so much cool stuff we can only do in big organized play settings.
Yeah. The other thing we did is the first people to get to the middle got an extra special encounter. So they felt very special, like, woo, we get this special encounter. We're like, yeah, we're slowing you down is what we're doing, because you can't fit, you get the penalty box essentially is really what it was. And then they had to get out of their special encounter. And meanwhile, the tables were catching up, which worked really well.
That's fun. A great way of doing that. Make it feel like a reward. I love this. I love everything that's happening right now. I was just going to say earlier that I think that specifically I know I just, had my whole spiel about the difference between, streamers versus like average players. But I think for the streamers, the YouTubers, the actual play type people in the community, I do think that having cinematic tools and the ability to create sort of machinima style visual content is going to be a huge, huge thing from the D&D virtual tabletop. And I mean, there are, again, Tailspire has a lot of those tools inbuilt as well. So I'm still kind of yet to see something that really sets this official virtual tabletop apart thus far in terms of the planned design. But I do think that is a valuable element specifically for that niche sector of the community. So that's worth saying, that the machinima stuff does seem cool.
Yeah, bringing up a niche segment of the community is really significant here, because the D&D community is less a community as it is about 8 billion different little niches. And
including the new speedrunning niche.
Yeah, and here's the speedrunning niche. And there's the organized play niche, which is a larger niche than most, but still its own niche. And here's the heavily story-driven diceless game practically niche. And here's the hyper dungeon-specific combat simulator niche. And this VTT is really going to experience all the same bumps and bruises that a whole new edition of D&D experiences, which is it needs to cater to every niche at once. So which ones will they prioritize? It's even worse for the VTT because they have to hard code these things. Usually with a new edition, we can just kind of be like, oh, use the game master can do it. With the VTT's got to do it.
Yeah, I'm curious to know if the VTT itself will become a niche kind of audience within D&D, because I think there's apprehension in the community, particularly among those that don't want to use the VTT or don't find it appealing, or like me, and I think Teos mentioned this earlier, with wanting to be able to see your players and look into their eyes, and the idea of only being able to see like this part of them because their screen
I'm
is
in
up.
that camp too. I know that I'm sounding very virtual tabletop friend. I do like playing in person. I'm just, yeah.
It feels like it's being positioned as the way to play D&D, and maybe that's coming from the community as much as it's coming from Wizards. I don't think Wizards have said that. I think they've positioned it as an option more than a necessity. At the same time, they're trying to sell this new product that they're developing, and so they want to push it as a great option. But I'm curious to see how ubiquitous it becomes, whether it becomes an expectation in the way that D&D Beyond has kind of become an expectation at different tables. I was at a convention on the weekend. I was at Conquest here in Melbourne, and we had pre-generated characters because we were running Agents of the Empire. and I couldn't see his screen because he had it turned away from me, but I'm pretty sure one of the players took their character sheet and quickly punched it into D&D Beyond so that they could play it in D&D Beyond rather than needing to rely on the character sheet itself, which I thought was fascinating. So yeah, I'm curious to see how ubiquitous it becomes.
In chat, D Emerald 573 has brought up a really cool, interesting thought. They're saying, I'm wondering if in the options you could put in little reminders to take breaks or to check in on players, little DM cues that you can configure. And I think that sort of thing would be a really cool inclusion for a virtual tabletop to have little beepity beep. Remember that you need to drink water. Oh, it's dinner time. You know, any number of those things, or you know, little cues like the MCDM DM screen has those little messages that say everyone's having a good time. Don't worry about it. You can have little pop-ups that say stuff like that.
Little private messages to send the GM.
If it's a highly customizable reminders function.
And DMs from players would be great for things like X cards without having to feel the sort of the weird over the top of the table, everyone knows that you're X-carding. That's always been a weird element of safety tools for me, and I think that would be really handy.
There is somebody commented in the YouTube comments of the last episode of the Lorecast, a virtual tabletop called One More Multiverse, I believe. I went and checked it out on the weekend. It's like a VTT. It's very video gamey as well because you move your character around using is it WASD off the top of my head? Oh, I've got a keyboard right in front of me. Yes, it is WASD to move your character around. But it had the private X card, which I thought was fascinating. And it kind of had the traffic light system of like red for X card, yellow for kind of just letting the group know that this is getting into uncomfortable territory, but not a hard no. So that tool exists there. It's all I'm saying.
Nothing new under the sun.
I want to talk about... And
if Wizards uses it, they will be accused of plagiarizing it.
Yeah. I do want to talk about the future of 5e itself, but I also just quickly want to slam through probably what will be smaller discussions before we jump into that first. So kind of doing a hard break down a side street. Kobold Press have announced the official name of Black Flag, which is now Tales of the Valiant, which they have abbreviated to TOV, but is it TOV or TOTV?
I prefer TOV. I mean, to be honest, I prefer Black Flag, but...
Why not abbreviate it to Valiant?
Ooh.
I mean, why are we... We don't need an acronym.
Why not just call it Valiant in the first place? I'm going to put on my hater hat. I don't like the name Tales of the Valiant all that much. I think it's going to be a fine game. I think it's going to be a good game. It's just a Tales of the Valiant. Just kind of doesn't roll off the tongue.
I wish when you opened the book, it said it in that exact voice.
It's like one of those birthday cards.
Yes. Oh my God, no one's done that in RPGs. That is an untapped market.
It is. Look, it is a bit of a mouthful, but so is Dungeons and Dragons. To be fair,
we've had 50 years to get over that.
I disagree. Also, it's alliterative.
2 books. They're going to do a Kickstarter in May, so not too far away, actually, pretty close. And they're going to have the Player's Guide, which is going to also, by the sounds of it, have all the DMG stuff kind of packed into there as well. And they're going to have a Monster Vault, which will be the monster manual for Tales of the Valiant. Tales of the Valiant? Yes. Tales of the Valiant. I was getting confused for a second there. And I'm kind of curious to see, because I do love Kobold Press's monster design. So my main interest here is seeing their take on some more sort of fundamental D&D style monsters that they haven't done previously because they've already been covered in the monster manual. So things like griffins, chimeras, those more treants or ents or whatever they're going to call them that won't get them sued. More of those more fundamental monsters I'd love to see their design of. So I'm excited for that, name irrespective. Speaking of which, the first draft of the Orc, I don't even know what that acronym stands. The something rules.
Open role-playing game. Something starting with C.
Something.
So it should be the Orguk is what we've learned today as well.
Just call it Valiant.
Just call it that. Everything should just be called Valiant.
It's the Open RPG Creative License.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're being very selective about what ends up in the acronym. I
should
see.
call it Goblin for short.
Did anybody take it's long?
I
It's like
took
4
one for the
pages
team.
long.
I read it.
Okay. Anything stand out, Dael?
I figure
that was
I set up
interesting.
an expectation when we were doing the OGL. I gotta actually read legal documents now. It is hard to read. I don't blame anyone who's put off, particularly you open up with definitions, which is, pretty standard. You want to make sure that there's this clarity that exists for any, sort of disagreements that arise, but they maybe get a little bit definition happy and define everything. And then you end up with a whole huge paragraph that is a little bit like reading Mad Libs before the additions have been made. So it's like, I took the noun down to the noun and the adjective verb. Like it's a little bit hard to read in that case. The actual content of the license, nothing stands out to me as being bad. It's all pretty good stuff, the stuff that they promised, but in legal jargon. Mm-hmm. There is an interesting thing that happens here where they're defining ORC content, and they kind of just start making lists. And I talked last time about the difficulty once you start including lists in sort of a legal license or a contract. And so they have things like, this is comprised of systems, procedures, processes, rules, laws, instructions, heuristics, routines, functional elements, commands, structures, principles, methodologies, operations, devices, and concepts of play. And that is every synonym they could think of, I'm sure. But creating this list, and they do it again for, stat blocks, traits, classes, jobs, alignments, professions, and it just kind of covers every possible synonym that they can think of. But the problem there is that once you've created a defined list, only things within that list are covered. So, all it takes is for someone to create something with a slightly different word from jobs, professions, classes, or whatever, and it suddenly isn't covered by the license. So I would recommend, rather than delivering it in the form of a list, that they liberally use including but not limited to. That's a really good phrase. Or find broader ways of covering those things rather than trying to think of every possible example that exists out there. That's my main sort of thing. I do think it is very funny to solicit public feedback on a license that is entire. We were talking about accessibility, inaccessible. It gets better in the last 2 pages or so, but
Did you read this part? Because I heard that any mechanics are automatically part of open content. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah. Basically.
That does seem to be more or less in line, not entirely in line. There's a big difference here still, but with the sort of ethos that Pathfinder has had over the years, where honestly, even though Paizo's publications themselves have been numerous, there is an immense oeuvre of like open Pathfinder content that the community has rallied around. Dozens of these teeny tiny little publishers who, to some niche of the Pathfinder community, are just as core as anything Paizo's ever published. And on top of that, unlike D&D, all of those Paizo books go in their near entirety straight into Paizo's SRD. And so it seems like they really want to keep that going. It's like, this is not sort of I don't want to say this. This is not sort of a free-for-all trough you can eat out of, right? And then make your own thing. Take your bowl, go somewhere else. If you're going to use this stuff, everything's going back into the pot. You are going to be a part of this community, and you better know that right from the jump.
And
it's very open source, yeah.
And that's interesting if you're doing D&D, but in theory, this would be used, I would think, more for non-D&D stuff, because that would be the point. Otherwise, you could, if you're doing D&D, you can just use the Creative Commons or use the OGL, like it's all still there. Mm-hmm. But, if I'm making my own RPG, do I really want to give away all the mechanics? And I know that there's some understanding of, mechanics can't be copyrighted, but that's pretty old law, and any court could change their mind. But this would just say to you, like, you don't own the mechanics you spent all that time creating. Ooh, That hurts me.
Right. Well, because it also comes down to the really specific elements of that, right? So we talk about you can't copyright a process, but that's like you can't copyright the you can copyright a specific expression or recipe to make bread, but you can't copyright the process of making bread, right? That's what that ultimately comes down to.
Right.
But that's where you start getting weird fine levels of detail between what counts as expression and what doesn't in terms of mechanics and game mechanics. This is very when I say that there's nothing in it that worries me, I mean from the side of the licensee, the person who is benefiting from the license, not the licensor. There's a lot of stuff in there that I'm like, wow, you're giving away a lot. Because it really does. In one of its lists, it goes on to include, cards, dice, literally any kind of randomizing process that you use to run this game. So it really is, going in and saying you're giving away basically everything. It does have some specifics in terms of what counts as, the product identity. But even then, it's much looser than the kind of thing that we've seen from D&D. It is very much a license that benefits the licensee over the licensor.
I got an email from Chaosium saying that their free sort of basic rules game, I forget what the fantasy role-playing game, something like that, that's already on Orc. And I'm like, it's only in draft. How is it already there? But they're clearly like, anything for somebody to take this game and use it. Like,
it is kind of wild to me that a legal license is now a driver of like consumer engagement. That's the thing that's wildest to me about this, because the Orc is impenetrable, as we've described. Impenetrable enough to the point where it's like, if you're a layperson, what you really want to see is a Cliff's Notes. But because that's not in legal jargon, it's meaningless. They could say anything in the Cliff's Notes and still, they can screw you in the fine print. And so it's like, how I feel like the average person has, through this whole OGL kerfuffle, maybe lost the plot a little bit. This OGL kerfuffle should IMO never have happened. I wish it never had happened for about a million reasons. But one of the weirder ones now is that now we're getting like legal documents as promotional material. Yeah, and I don't like that one bit.
I also think that we ended up with kind of a bizarre expectation, right? Because the OGL, people might remember at the time that I had actually criticisms based on this because they were writing it very deliberately in natural language so that people would be able to understand it who weren't, legal professionals, which I think is a great thing to do if you are, soliciting public feedback, if you are trying to make this something that is accessible to a layperson. That's an awesome thing to do. I think that they were couching certain secret little things in their naturalized language, which I complained about. And now I'm complaining that this one is too legal jargony.
And that's the thing. You can't win.
You can't win. There's nothing you can do.
There is like an odd expectation from the community and it feels like opportunism from other companies around this OGL thing, as you were saying, James, because I don't know, but my understanding is that did Chaosium have any sort of open license with their rule set before this OGL controversy, before their recent release of their generic role-playing fantasy hero-making system of awesomeness? Vampire Masquerade don't, as far as I know. You can't build a game based on Vampire Masquerade. I don't know about Paizo. I believe they did have a Pathfinder style OGL. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's just the impression. But it's starting to kind of weirdly become an expectation that, like, if you're a good company, if you're a consumer-friendly company, you will provide access to your rule set via a license for other creators to be able to use. And it's an odd expectation to have of a corporation that probably wants to protect their property so that they can, profit off it themselves and don't end up, as Wizards were afraid of, creating their own competitors. Now, which is a different situation with Wizards because they're a bigger company, and B, we've had the OGL for however many years before now.
I actually agree with the sentiment that it's kind of a prerequisite to being a good, healthy RPG publisher to offer your fans free access to your rules as creators. Because in the early days of D&D, pre Wizards of the Coast, right? TSR era. When there were basically only a handful of D&D books, that game lived and died on fanzines, pre-internet fanzines, right? That you mailed to people.
Yeah.
And TSR had kind of a reputation for being hyper litigious when it came to their properties, and so D&D got a really bad rep for being the game that shut down small creators long before Wizards ever entered the picture.
And they would have people followed at conventions, right? I mean, they were brutal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, to me, that's the sort of thing I never want to see again. A pure hobbyist. It removed third-party creators from this equation entirely. I never want to see hobbyists get burned for publishing the stuff they make for a game they love. And, I have my own opinions as a third-party creator when it comes to third-party creators. I want them to succeed for, altruistic but also purely selfish reasons. But it's people who just love games. I want people who love their games to never have to fear about getting in hot water for wanting to share their love of the game with other people.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, and I'll disagree with that. Like, I love where you're coming
Bring
from.
on the hot water.
At the same time, if I want to be a fan, that's cool, right? I can do a blog and I can write my Eberron love story, and that's all good. That's fan content, right? But if I put a price tag on that, it's not fan love content anymore. It is a product, and I'm profiting, even if it's a very bad profit, even if it's a loss. I'm making money. I'm taking in revenue off of someone else's ideas. And that's why these things have to exist, right? Like Critical Role used to have everybody do whatever you want. And then they're like, okay, we need a fan policy. And Monte Cook Games, the same thing. Because eventually you just go like, we have people just running an organized play program that we have completely disconnected from. And I have no idea what's going on. And there's a stage where that stuff's great. And there's a stage you want to go, okay, how is our brand being represented out there, and who's going to download something and think it's official, and the bigger you are, the more that matters, right? And that's why you a lot of times you see these brands grow up and they go, oh, wait a minute. But when a line is new or no one's playing it, then you're willing to take big risks, and because anybody, any sound bites or whatever are helpful or could be helpful potentially, and so you're willing to risk.
Yeah,
Teos, I end up agreeing with you on that. I think that a free-for-all is no good. But having those official guardrails in place is necessary. It's good for those to be there.
Also, frankly, I mean, it's a very it has been for a long time a shockingly generous space in terms of copyright versus trademark. You know what I mean? Trademarks are hardcore. You must pursue legal action against someone who infringes on a trademark, and that has been shockingly sparse on the ground when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons stuff, which I think is something that kind of gets lost in the weeds of other things. I will say as well, the other thing that came from the naturalized language of the OGL is that we now have a whole community of people, myself included, who fancy ourselves lawyers. Right? We read this thing, we're like, I get it. I know how this works, and we move on to read the ORC, and it turns out we don't, and we're unhappy about that. And, my thing that I would love to never see again is any of us pretending to be lawyers. Legal kimchi can talk about it. The rest of us have to shut up. That's the sort of thing there. Someone did bring up in chat, Horrible Cabbage. I would love for any of these actually lawyer people to explain the significant differences to me between this ORC license and if this stuff were to be licensed under Creative Commons BY. Because, Creative Commons attribution features a lot of the same kind of stuff that they're trying to cover in the ORC. And I am beginning to wonder, wouldn't it be easier if the different licenses just each license their thing under Creative Commons?
And that's where it becomes a marketing tool.
James hit it on the head.
Somebody said earlier that the orcs seem to be the fail-safe. In fact, I can still see it. It was chili draws, that the orc was the fail-safe if WotC didn't reverse course. And I think that's what the community sentiment around Black Flag was a little bit. Sorry, Tales of the Valiant. Because it was kind of like,
they should just call it Valiant. Yep.
what's the point of this now? Because Wizards have kind of reversed course, but Kobold have committed to Black Flag, and Black Flag. Look, In all honesty, I'm excited to see a lot of branching 5e style systems that have this shared language so they're easy to pick up and play, but notes the differences and find your preferences depending on whether you prefer Valiant or you prefer 5e, which we'll talk about in just a moment.
I reckon people are going to still call it Black Flag. I'm making my prediction now. People are not going to change what they're calling it.
Valiant Flag.
Well,
Valiant Flag.
Speaking of names, let us in the few moments that we have left, very quickly, jump into discussing the future of 5e, which is no longer 1D&D, not 5.5. It's not 5.1 or 5.25.
It is 5.5. They could be like, oh, we're just refurbishing the rules of 5e that we've had for 10 years. No, it's 5.5.
Yeah, it's like, all right, Microsoft, just settle down over there. 5EX, 5EXL, the new D&D 5e.
Yeah, this is the Final Fantasy X-II.
Well, it's going to become confusing, right? How do you, and how does this
edition,
affect...
Second edition, sorry. Jago Mistweave.
I was recording the news for Mastering Dungeons, and I found myself now having to use the term 2024 because you always have to call it something, right? And maybe once the books come out, we'll call it 5e, but you always need a reference point. You can't just say, 5e, like instead of how it was in 5e. Right now in 5e, it's this way.
Exactly.
That doesn't work. You've
Just
got to
like
say
God of
something.
War
So now I'm
2020.
saying 2024, 2014, and it's like, that makes...
All right, speaking of predicting Black Flag and
5e
Valiant, what they end
series.
up calling it, what do we think that this is going... Because there's been a lot of discussion about how 5e was not what Wizards called the game back when it was D&D Next or whatever their marketing term was back then. 5e was a term that was kind of created by the community to refer to this thing. Do we think this is going to end up with the 5.5 moniker? Was 3e called 3.5 by Wizards, or was it... Okay, so they actually named it that. Because it's also confusing in terms of, like, they're talking about this backwards compatibility, which is great, and we've talked about how from the Unearthed Arcanas, it doesn't maybe look as backwards compatible as they were first making it out, but maybe it will be more so, and they're going to pull back from the Unearthed the changes that they've made so far to make it feel a bit more compatible. Can you have old species, they've taken half elves and half orcs out of the next player's handbook, but they've said, but if you really want to use those species traits, you can use them from the 2014
They may or may not be continuing to call
version.
them species.
They may or may not be continuing to call them species. Which is, it's just exhausting. This stuff usually happens behind closed doors for a reason, I feel.
Yeah, but you can't in this world. What I really liked about that session where Jeremy Crawford talked about compatibility is that they seem to get it. So Jeremy Crawford shared that he worked, I think, as a freelancer, moving monsters from 3rd edition to 3.5. And he said, that was a new edition. It wasn't 0.5. And I'm like, okay, good. You get it. You get the problems, right? And I feel like just a few months ago, Kyle was saying on interviews, it's 5.5. And I'm like, that means a lot of things. And I think Wizards has paused to say, what are we calling this thing? And how are we approaching this? And so Jeremy said, anything that's a number as an identifier of what its kind of power level is will not change. So if a beholder is CR11, it will remain CR11. It's not going to suddenly switch. The beholder itself could change, but the number will be the same, such that if it appears in an encounter in an old adventure, you can use the new version, right? Or if a spell, like in some of the early playtest packets, I think the few spells change levels. So that's not going to happen anymore, right? Bark Skin, if it's a 3rd level spell, 2nd level spell, I forget what it is, but whatever level it is currently in 2014, it's going to be the same in 2024. It may change what it does. Maybe it's 10 hit points now, but it is the same power level and should work. So you could cast either version at the table and it functions, right? It works together. And that's their view of compatibility, right? These things can coexist. They're not the same. They don't perfectly interlock, right? You play an old class and you get your subclass at 1st level. I play a new one and I get it at 3rd level, but we can play at the same table and the world doesn't fall apart. Whereas 3.5, it really got pretty painful for most people if they tried to mix. And so you just ended up throwing away all the old stuff. So I think that's their approach. I'm just glad they're thinking about it. That's my win to me, is that they're, zeroing in on it, and hopefully we'll be better.
It feels like, and what you're saying makes me think, okay, Tales of the Valiant is becoming a lot more relevant because, as someone who's been playing 5e for 6 years now, and I know that everybody's kind of at a different point in their journey with the game D&D, and I don't want to say I called it, but I was like 5 months ago sort of saying Wizards are in a rock and a hard place between doing a rules refresh and creating something entirely new and shedding half their audience that really love 5e, or staying in the same place, trying to keep as much of their audience together as possible, but risking the game stagnating. And when you say to me that monster CRs are going to stay the same, spell levels aren't going to change, that feels like stagnation to me. It's like you can change a few numbers here and there, but like I really want a version of Cyclops or an Etten. Maybe I'll get that in Big B Presents, the Giants book. But I really want like CR7 versions of those monsters. I would love to see alternative takes on, different monsters that kind of sit in that mid CR3 700, doing the translation in my head, sort of slot. And so hearing that, like, It feels like when a new console generation comes out and a video game tries to do both generations, really they're just shackling themselves to the limitations of the previous hardware. It feels like this new version of 5e is shackling itself to the limitations of the previous edition.
I think that's why they shared the weapon mastery news, to try to showcase how there can be exciting things. And it was funny. I mean, everybody in the room was like, ooh. It worked. So.
Yeah, that's fair. That is, I did not think about that.
It's interesting that 4th edition, for example, did have scaling monsters. It had, here's this dragon. Here's how you would fight it if your party are 5th level. Here's how you would fight it if your party is 17th level, right? Like you can scale it up and down. Of course, once again, as I feel the need to say every time I bring up 4th edition and its positive qualities, you do kind of need a computer for that to be an easy process. But, there are previous sort of examples that they can draw from if they want to start implementing that kind of thing. And I would be remiss not to bring up, of course, as well, Flea Mortals by MCDM, which gives a great example of here's a bunch of 5e style, but, written differently, monsters that it's like, here's goblins. Here's a kind that you can use if you need a bruiser. Here are some snipers. Here are some minions. Here's, and they give you a bunch of different ones to pull from depending on what you might need for a given encounter or the level of difficulty that you want for a given encounter. I think there's a lot of hunger for that kind of monster design. I really hope that we see that with 5.5.
Yeah, I think you've brought up a really good point there, which is what excites me, and I kind of hinted at this without even realizing it when I name dropped Valiant again, which is like what this does provide, and what the name, like staying with the name 5e, does do is benefit third parties who can fill that niche of alternative game design ideas, alternative ways of doing things that 5e is not necessarily going to risk doing, or Wizards aren't going to risk doing. And additionally, they probably don't need to go and change all their marketing and the little 5e logo on all their books to 5.5 if the name's just staying the same. So it keeps the compatibility for, older Grimhollow books or older MCDM books that have been based on 5e, which is probably a positive. I'm curious to know if this is like, because Wizards are obviously trying to navigate what's best for the game, but also what's best for them as a corporation, right? There's those two considerations that they have. And I'm curious to know, and only time will tell, I suspect, if this is what is best for the game. Or them as a corporation for that matter.
And sometimes it's just a point in time, right? I mean, like, I'm really happy. I liked 4E, but I would hope that a person who hated 4E would still say that was great for the game to go through that step. Sure. We couldn't have 5E without 4E. And I'm looking forward to 6E because it will learn from 5E and 2024 5E, right? Because that's how this works, right? And sometimes when games are not great, like 4E was what, it divided its audience. And one of the things that happened is, and people were not making 4E third-party products. So they went out and made really cool role-playing games, right? They made Numeneras, and they made 13th Ages, and they made lots of different kinds of games. And they dominated Emmys awards for doing it because they were so cool and innovative. And sometimes when the 5e is so popular and so pleasing everybody, and everybody's playing it, or offshoots, right? Whether it's Paizo or Valiant or whatever, everybody's just sort of tinkering around with the same tools. And that's cool because it makes for a great 5e home campaign. And I'm down with that. But also I really love it when someone brings in just a whole new RPG and a whole new approach, right?
Well, we have gone a little over time. I just wanted to make sure we managed to hit all of those news items for the most part. Quickly,
we can't get enough of Teos Abadia.
Well, Teos is probably like, I got to get out of here. Like, I've been on this number 2 podcast for long enough. I need to. I quickly wanted to shout out. That means a lot because I know you recorded Mastering Dungeons too.
But it comes out in 2 days.
Daniel Kwan has done a really good breakdown of the Creator Summit as well, in terms of, like, I started reading their blog post. I'll see if I can quickly post a link in the chat, although I'm on a Mac, so this might be a little bit precarious.
Boo! Boo!
I did it! I've learned the ways of the MacBook, even though this is not a MacBook. Ben.
Give us a real stinker of a segue. Bring back our old Ben. Just make us feel good.
It's got I didn't read the whole blog post because it's fairly overwhelming in the amount of news that's there, but it looked like a pretty good breakdown from what I was able to read.
It was very thorough, yeah.
Also, go check out alphastream.org for Teos's blog for additional information and context around the Creator Summit. I found that really, really useful and engaging as well. Teos, where can folks find you if they want to see more of your work?
Alphastream.org is the great place to go to find me on any of the various places that I frequent, whether it's the YouTube or the podcast, Mastering Dungeons. I would argue it's the third best. I'm really a big fan of Ken and Robin talk about stuff, but so I'd say that's number 1, and then we're somewhere there. But so you can find Mastering Dungeons, you can find alphastream.org. From there, you can get to the YouTubes and all the other fun things I do. But I appreciate it. Hang out there and then go find other cool creators. Go check out Sean's stuff. That's really the best use of anyone's time.
I appreciate you being here, Teos. If you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast and you're watching it on YouTube, make sure to give it a like, subscribe to the channel. Really appreciate all that sort of stuff. Rate it if you're on audio platforms. I'm really terrible at this, so I'm just going to close it out. My name's Ben Byrne. I've been here with James Hake, Dael Kingsmill, Teos Abadia, and we will be back next week with another episode of the Eldritch Lorecast.